investors could invest in a much more holistic Solana company by us putting Solana on our balance sheet, but also being completely a Solana-driven technology company.
The day the Trump coin launched, Solana DEXs did double the volume of both Kraken and Coinbase combined.
Are you open to looking at other assets? Let's say Hyperliquid does exceptionally well. Welcome to the DCo Podcast, where we bring you stories from founders and investors in Web3. Before we get started, this is not a financial or legal advice. It's just a conversation about things we find interesting in Web3. Views expressed are our own personal opinions. DCo members or guests appearing on the show may have positions on assets they talk about. All right. Welcome to another episode of the DCo Podcast. Today we have with me Leah Wald, who's the CEO of Sol Strategies, and Max Kaplan, who is the CTO at Sol Strategies. Before Sol Strategies, Leah founded Valkyrie Investments and she sold that business to CoinShares, and she has been an author and she's had multiple investment-related positions. So yeah, a seasoned market participant or market player, to say the least. Max used to be an engineer at Kraken. He was there for about 6 years, if I'm not wrong, Max. And post that, he started his validator business, and, someone who's been there in the weeds and really understands, what it means to be a validator and runs, I think, the validator business at Sol Strategies. Welcome to the show. And yeah, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so before we get into what you used to do and, all of that, first thing that I wanted to ask is, how do we reconcile these two things? Because Bitcoin started as, Satoshi wanted it to be peer-to-peer digital cash. And now we have a bunch of crypto assets which are on corporates' balance sheets. And it's, there are various vehicles for you to trade these assets on typical stock exchanges now. I think it's not necessarily bad, but it's probably a little bit of a detour from what we wanted these things to be at the beginning. So, just make us make sense of that.
Max, what do you think?
Yeah, so on the context of Bitcoin and SPACs, correct? Yeah. Yeah, well, listen, so here's what I would say is that, obviously, in terms of treasuries, right? MicroStrategy was really the first one that, did the whole, treasury type company, with Bitcoin, right? And, they have done a fantastic job, right? And, I think the results of the company really speak for itself. For us, though, we really looked at things, and to be honest, it was really Leah, because, Leah came on as CEO and did a lot of this before me, right? But I'm going to hype her up right now. But, listen, there's when we love Bitcoin, I came from the Bitcoin world and so did Leah, right? So we're not talking badly about Bitcoin at all. But there are unique advantages that a Solana-based company, Solana treasury company, which we don't really view ourselves necessarily as a treasury company, but let's just talk generally about Solana treasury companies. There are unique advantages of doing it with Solana, right? And really the biggest one is that Bitcoin is a fantastic asset, but you can't make native yield on it, right? And with Solana, you can. And that I think is really the biggest difference is, for us, we're able to make native yield in, really two ways that are pretty similar, but, staking and also our validator business, right? And from there, a treasury company, does things like issue debt to go and buy up more, in a Bitcoin world, issue debt, buy up more Bitcoin, right? And for us, Solana treasury companies, they do that as well. But we're also able to acquire Sol at a cheaper price because we're able to make native yields on both the staking side and the validator business side, right? So that's, I think, how the companies, I think, differ overall. Obviously, I can get into the differences between Solana and Bitcoin, which we view Solana more as a network, where we view Bitcoin more as an asset, and really our view really is this, is that, we think Solana is going to see the most economic activity of all blockchains. Because of that, we want to be running validators because of the fact that if you're running a validator, you get a portion of the transaction fees. As we see more and more things come on chain and more activity props up, that'll be more revenue we make, more Sol we generate. And then, the cheaper we can acquire Sol. That's what I would say. Leah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I think that was absolutely perfect. I completely agree. We're now seeing obviously lots of different treasury vehicles that are coming out. As Max mentioned, we see ourselves as different. We're focused on the underlying technology, but why Solana is important, at the time, especially when we launched our strategy, there was no ETFs, there was no other public vehicles that were focused on Solana. And the market was very interested in investing in Solana. And for all the reasons that made the ETF successful, they couldn't. There's still so many barriers to entry to invest in spot. Now, those are definitely decreasing, very much so, across a lot of the banks in the United States and globally. And it's still a little bit of a TBD if that does become a preferred method of buying spot. As of right now, there still are restrictions for certain registered investment advisors in the United States and other allocators to actually buy spot. So we wanted to provide another opportunity where investors could invest in a much more holistic Solana company by us putting Solana on our balance sheet, but also being completely a Solana-driven technology company. So we thought that that would be, one, interesting in the market, but also, two, we were just really excited to do it.
So when Michael Saylor started doing this for MicroStrategy and people realized that, okay, this thing works because you get to borrow money either really cheap or at 0% interest rates and, give bondholders that option to either, convert it to stock or give out cash, whatever, right? We'll get into the mechanics later. But I just want to understand the thought process behind, okay, the Bitcoin was fine. It was kind of acceptable. The market reacted fantastic to, MicroStrategy doing this. What was it that allowed you guys to think that, okay, now, since it is done for Bitcoin, we can do this for Solana? And, when 2, 3, 4, 5 companies do it, the path kind of becomes clear as to what you need to do to issue this kind of debt and, borrow and, buy Solana, stake it or whatever. But you guys being like really one of the first ones to do that, I just want to understand like what was the thought process, and it's really the direction of the company, right? I mean, 95% of the revenue comes from the validator sets that you guys run, if I'm not wrong, right? It's ballpark 95%. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big decision as a company. I just want to understand how you guys, arrived at that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. And you had a lot of different parts of that question, so I'm going to try to hit them all. I think one of them was financing, and then one is generally strategic direction and how all in we are and right is kind of what I'm hearing. So yeah, I mean, as previously mentioned, what happened was originally Soul Strategies was a company called Cypherpunk Holdings. And Cypherpunk Holdings was listed on the CSE, the Canadian Securities Exchange, in 2018 by a whole bunch of cypherpunks, and they're amazing. So at the time, they converted the balance sheet of what was a different company. It was a hostile takeover of a uranium mining company, actually. So converted the balance sheet assets to Bitcoin and made Bitcoin investments. And it was effectively the first public company in North America to provide that Bitcoin vehicle. And that was very interesting at that time. Now, fast forward, we hit 2024. There's obviously Bitcoin vehicles, Bitcoin ETFs, but there was nothing for Solana. And the market was really, really interested in buying and having access to Solana. But for us, still technologists, we really wanted to be part of that ecosystem and run validators and actually build a Solana tech company. So it was really twofold. So to your point, we're the first in North America, to my understanding, the first Solana very specific public equity in the world. I would love to know of a different one, but at least I know we're first in North America. But it was also important, again, that we actually started a tech company. And that was under our former CIO, Mo Adam, who's the founder of BitAccess, the first Bitcoin ATM company. So really old school cypherpunk. And then we got Max to come on, and Max and Mo had a great relationship as well. So again, for us, it was a strategic advancement and development that we saw. We think that MicroStrategy is still very powerful, but the beauty of what Saylor did was Saylor, and that was 2020. I mean, he had this vision and a powerful company to boot, and he had been a public company CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company for many, many years. And he had, with his conviction, threw it into Bitcoin and then educated the public on Bitcoin and kept that rallying call. So that's where I see there's an extreme difference of where we are in 2025, but also last year in 2024, is we're past needing just to rally cry the market and have just a vehicle. Instead, we need companies. And I think that the market understands that, and they have. If you look at the different investors in our company, it's not just a couple, it's a lot of different investors. And it's across the board of retail, institution, allocated in ETFs as well. So the only thing I'll say on your point is definitely there's been a lot of strategy, treasury vehicles that have come out. But what's interesting to us that we believe is the future development, and we think that we'll see more of, and you're already seeing some transitions, is that the market is so sophisticated at this point that they are looking for companies. They do want to look at fundamental analysis. They do want to make comparative valuations with how did the mining companies do, via historicity in the past. So that's the evolution that we see. MicroStrategy was brilliant, again, because of Saylor, and he was able to structure a very interesting capital market strategy. Now, for our capital market strategy, to hit your second question, I think, it's different because we can get that native yield on Solana, right? And you can't on Bitcoin. So because of that, we can structure things very differently that we think are more attractive to investors. Obviously, us and all other of the companies that are popping up are different than MicroStrategy. We're small, micro caps. We're small caps. We're small fledglings, which means the financing needs to be different. And I think that there's a ill expectation that everybody will finance similar to Strategy, when truthfully, we're not the same company as Strategy. They're running a different operating business and have been financing their capital market strategy in a very unique way, again, for over 5 years now. So what we think we're doing is smarter and more tuned to what is natural to the yield that we're generating from our validators, which is why the last financing round, a portion of the interest payments, if you will, are kicked back from our staking yield. So that, I'll let you read more into it. It's all public documents. But for us, that was an interesting mechanism that hadn't been done before, is to take on debt financing that, again, that interest payment is a portion of the staking yield from the SOL that we buy, that we stake to our validator. And therefore, again, for us, it's incredible. More SOL, more revenues on the staking side, on the validator business side. And we think that's the future. And I think I got the questions, but if I missed one, maybe Max could hit it.
I think you nailed all of them.
Okay, good.
All right. So when I first started looking at these companies, I mean, the finance brain or the equity research brain, it kicked in and it was like, why is the market paying like $2 for a stock which holds crypto assets which are worth like $1, right? Where is that premium coming from? Natural, first reaction is obviously that, well, there aren't too many vehicles that are in the market, right? That is point number one, which allows, everyday people or institutions that have mandatory restrictions into, whether you can't invest into crypto assets through, exchanges like Coinbase, whatever, you need to hold things on stock exchange and in those forms. So probably because they don't have any other way to get exposure to crypto assets, this is how they do it. And that is where that premium comes from. Secondly, I think what you mentioned, like what Saylor did was also super clever. He, I think, increased the TAM of investors by, telling the bondholders or people who trade in bonds, saying, look, you are getting like whatever, 2, 3, less than 2% a year on treasuries. I give you this massive call option. It's like heads you win and tails also you win kind of a thing. So if BTC goes berserk like it always does in pretty much like 4 years' time, you make way more than what you would have made holding treasury assets, right? If BTC doesn't, well, you're not losing out on much. I'm giving you back your 100% of the cash, right? So it was not the people who hold BTC who were attracted to this option. It was people who held like treasury assets who were attracted to that option, right? So, and that market is way bigger than people realize, right? I mean, it's way bigger than people who trade crypto or whatever, right? On the other hand, like you mentioned, the yield that you get by staking assets, right? That is how you can entice bondholders. And that is where company like Strategy comes into the picture. BTC is still fine. It's a, $1.5, $2 trillion asset. And the volatility is dampening, year by year as more and more market participants are okay with it. But something like Sol, obviously it is smaller. It is more volatile. So I want to understand how the conversations with, like when you want to raise, how those conversations pan out and how are you pitching? So because you're giving me 5% yield or 10% yield through Validator, that is fine. But what's the use of it if the asset is going to tank like 50% in a year?
I'll start and then I'll kick it to Max. And I actually think, so I'll hit your first comment about premium to NAV and then the second one. And I'm going to toss it to Max because I think it'd be helpful for your listeners then to just understand why we think Solana is superior. Because in the end of the day, it's a bet on Solana's future. And for why would they pick Sol strategies over other, vehicles is a leveraged bet that we're building something great in Solana, and therefore a more sophisticated bet on its future. But in its basis, it's an investor feeling bullish on Solana, right? So that's where it comes down to. And so I think it'll be helpful for Max to talk about why we're bullish Solana. But to your first question, and this is the most annoying answer under the sun, but you come from capital markets. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's price discovery. So as of right now, investors are willing to pay that premium. So, and especially for our stock, we've had a premium to NAV since our strategy launched. But that's where we then really hit the rallying call on our first earnings in January 28th, our fiscal year is September 30th, of you can't compare us just to NAV, right? But again, prior to that, people only did. And there was that premium. But to your point, there was no other vehicles. And in the end of the day, wherever a market is set, a market is set. Now, the question is, can it maintain that premium, right? And that's where I think that the other treasury vehicles are going to have issues in the future, because as more vehicles come out and they try to compete against us, right, as an actual company, then I think premiums compress. But in the end of the day, yes, that's always the question. Oh my gosh, that premium is overblown. But then you step back and you say, oh, but they're still trading at that level. And there's a lot of volume and there's a lot of participants. So to be honest, it's a tough argument for, I think, a lot of investors, institutional investors, to make for short-term investment horizon, because there's such a healthy market for all these companies right now. But to your point, what's the long-term strategy? That will compress. There's no treasury vehicle that's going to be able to compete with a spot ETF, a staked spot ETF in the US, a company like ours that actually has, revenue. So I think that that's going to compress. So I just wanted to hit that one. Now, in the end of the day, yes, as mentioned, it's a bet on Solana. You asked the question, what is it like for me to pitch? It's education, right? For the most part, who you're talking to and who I've spoken to and been pitching for the past year. And to be honest, what's been interesting, it hasn't been retail. I haven't pitched retail ever. I'm on podcasts, but I have 2 investor calls tomorrow. It's institutional allocators. It's the top shops. It's the family offices. It's the ETF allocators and portfolio managers. And for the most part, they come from either the mining world and they're comfortable with small cap mining, or they already have Bitcoin ETFs and allocation to Bitcoin. And their question is, what should I do next? And that starts the conversation. Now, what happens next for me is I need to explain why Solana, right? In the end of the day, they have their allocation of Bitcoin and or they want a more leveraged bet now that Bitcoin has normalized in a certain way. It was their volatile alpha, and maybe it's not enough alpha for what they allocated their, let's say, 1% of the portfolio of a more risky portfolio to. So end of the day, it starts with education. Then I try to explain the company. I get some glassed over, eyes when I try to explain validators and the intricacies of the network. But everyone seems to understand and believe that Solana is the best bet and is moving away from Ethereum. So I'm seeing mainly investors with Bitcoin and Solana, that their interest levels are and that they'll allocate to us. And that's also why we're being allocated in some of the ETF portfolios, and or early Bitcoin mining investors who still hold, let's say, CleanSpark Marathon, and they see us also akin to that story and they want to get in early to that. And that's also an easy narrative to discuss. So that's how those conversations go. End of the day, they have to be bullish Solana. Otherwise, they're not interested in us. And that's fantastic because that's the way that we structure the company. Max, why are we bullish Solana and not Ethereum?
Yeah, well, also too, I wanted to touch on like one point too in terms of premium to NAV. And like to understand our business, especially like, for your audience too, it's like this, it's that, yes, we are a treasury company, but like, we have 3.6 million SOL delegated to our validators, right? Which is like something like $525 million. And just to put things into perspective, if you were to sum up all of our stake, would be like the 19th biggest operator on the entire network, bigger than some of the biggest centralized exchanges out there, right? And, it's like Leah touched on a great point, which is right. Like, listen, like we are a Solana based company and our value is going to be very tied to Solana, right? But if you take a step back and you think about, okay, like how does the network work and like what is going to make Solana succeed? What is going to make Solana succeed is more economic activity happening on Solana, right? And the beneficiaries of that, like there's going to be several, don't get me wrong, but one of them certainly is going to be validators, right? Because of the very fact that the more transactions there are, the higher the fees, things like that, the more revenue the company is going to generate, right? So like, you asked a great question, like what's the difference between holding SOL, and staking it versus like, holding a stock like Soul Strategies, right? I'll just say like to not pitch people that, like I'm not pitching anyone to hold Soul Strategies, but like a hypothetical generic company like ours, we are, and they kind of touched on it. It's like, it's a leverage play. It's the fact that with Solana, the more Solana succeeds, the more revenue we are going to generate, right? And to talk about like Solana and why we are bullish on Solana, I mean, listen, like if you look at like any major metric, whether it's DEX volumes, whether it's rev on chain, whether it's active addresses, transactions, right? It's like night and day. Solana is way better, right? And then you look at too, like some of the cool things that is coming on Solana, and like our view really is like, okay, cool, the tech is there. Like we've proven out, just to put things into perspective too, like, so I worked at a centralized exchange, Kraken, right? For 6 years. I was one of the first engineers there. The day the Trump coin launched, Solana DEXs did double the volume of both Kraken and Coinbase combined. Okay. At that point, that proves that like tech works, right? And, but like, listen, like, like meme coins can be like extractive and, I don't want to get into meme coins, but like, think about when like bigger assets get on chain, equities. We announced our intent to be the first company to list their stocks on chain, right? And there's a lot of other companies trying to do this as well. And like they're really picking Solana. Like even Kraken, for example, they have their own layer 2. They announced they're going to Solana, right? So, like we really see that like, okay, cool. Like if you look at like any data, like try and find a data point, like the only 2 data points out there that Ethereum is beating Solana on, sorry, I know I'm rambling, is like TVL and stablecoin supply. And both of those really have like a first mover effect because Ethereum has just been around for so much longer. If you look at like anything that doesn't really like factor in the length of time as a variable, Solana is really crushing it. So that's really why we're all in on Solana.
In terms of TVL, I think it's not a metric that matters a lot because what matters more is the velocity of assets and which chain can support that velocity, right?
Yeah.
And you touched upon meme coins. So I just want to add a little bit there where there is this narrative on Twitter which said that Solana has like over reliance on meme coins and whatever. But it's a little backwards because I think meme coins happened on Solana because it could take on all of that volume.
Yeah.
They would have happened elsewhere had that chain been capable of tackling all that volume at a cost that Solana does. So I don't know what you guys think about it when someone says that it's a risk for Solana that, it relies a lot on meme coins for generating revenue for validators.
Yeah. Well, so listen, here's what I'd say about this is like, I come from a data background, we were talking about this before the call, and, I like to use the terms signal and noise, right? And I think meme coins are noise, okay? Because yes, they generated like a ton of revenue and like, like that is what really got like, that is really what Solana was in 2024. Okay. But like, you got to step back and look at like why that happened and also how successful it was. Right. And that's where I think the real signal is. So to go like step into that, like for example, like there was many other chains these meme coins could have launched on. Why did they choose Solana? It's really 2 things. It's number 1, as you correctly touched on, it's really the only chain that could support real volume. Number 2, it's that it's like the best UX out there, right? It's that like the users are there, Okay. Like users are there. Users like want to use Solana because it's so much easier. With like Ethereum, for example, people in your audience, you probably tried to use a layer 2 and, you might have like a token on base that you want to use, but you don't have any ETH on base, but you have it on Arbitrum and you got to bridge back from Arbitrum to the ETH L1, then back to, the base L1. It's like a really crappy UX. And like even me sometimes, like I have issues like understanding, like, like I'll be like, why isn't this transaction going through? And I'm like, oh, damn, I didn't even realize I don't have ETH on like, base. And Solana is just like easier to use, right? So like that is the real signal. And then also too, the other real signal is this. And like I kind of touched on it, but I really want to harp on this point is that like Solana has done, like I said, like that data point I talked about, where the day Solana dexes did double the volume of both Kraken and Coinbase combined, right? Like no matter what asset it is, like volume is volume, right? And like success is success. Like the fact that Solana was able to do that is like a huge signal, right? And that is why I think that so many of these like tokenized equities projects are picking Solana. Because like if you look at like DEX volumes across all chains, like ever in the history of time and history of blockchain, like that Solana absolutely blew the all-time high out of the water that day. Like that was uncharted territory. And I think that day proved that like Solana can actually handle real volume. So like to tie this back into meme coins, it's that you could almost look at meme coins as like a stress test. And like as like proving that Solana can actually handle this, I personally would like to see a world where there are better assets being traded on chain. And I think that will happen. I think if you just look at like what's going around, like it's pretty clear real world assets are going to come on chain, right? Between equities, real estate, so many things. And I think we've proven out the tech and I think it's going to happen. So that's what I would say.
I'll just say that I got bullish Solana from Pump Fun. So obviously, I think it's great. I really did. It was so interesting, but to see such a robust marketplace, and even though it's kind of a crazy thing to see, it is very much a healthy market. And it reminded me of Bitcoin exchanges in the early days. And so it made me feel as if this ecosystem, which already had developed so much and was already very developed, still was in its nascent stages and just had so much participation and interest. So I agree with everything Max is saying. And I think that it's fascinating and shows participation.
I think the only ecosystem that comes close right now, or, gives me Solana vibes is Hyperliquid. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but yeah, no incentives, no nothing, and the volume just keeps going up and up. And people who are like serious traders do vouch for the product itself. And I really like how they are tying their liquidity with the normal chain that they are building, right? I mean, with builder codes and with really sharing that liquidity with every other application that gets built on the Hyper EVM, and how they are sharing fees, etc., with the developers so that they don't need to bother about bootstrap and liquidity. I think their approach is pretty cool. So the question to you guys is like, are you guys paying attention to other markets and what could take some of the share away from Solana? And, how does all of that work? Like, are you open to looking at other assets? Let's say Hyperliquid does exceptionally well in the next year or two, or is it like only Solana? How does that work?
Yeah, listen. Well, I'll say this, that Hyperliquid has been doing a great job. Like they deserve a ton of credit, right? But our view really is this, is that we still think Solana is going to win. And we think Hyperliquid still has, like, listen, it has strong momentum. And I don't want to take away any credit that they are due because they have done a fantastic job. But Solana has like a bunch of strategic advantages, right? And, listen, like, I think one of the coolest things that Hyperliquid does, like, in my personal opinion, is like, placing cancels, putting them in the top of the block and building like a very good trading experience, right? And they also just like purpose built a product. Like, I don't even know if I call it like an L1, like it is an L1, but it's like almost like it's like not an L1, it's like not an app. It's like somewhere in the middle, right? And there's a lot of work being done on Solana to get to a point where we're going to be able to do similar things. And I am very bullish that that's going to happen very soon. And it might not be like the most perfect ways. Like, listen, there are teams that are working on this. And, I don't want to share like anything that, teams are working on, but, until they announce it. But, I really think that we're going to be able, get to a point where we're able to do a lot of the things that, Hyperliquid, really optimized for. And at the same time, still reap a lot of the benefits that Solana has. And like the biggest benefit, the biggest factor that Solana has really is users. Okay. Is that like there are users that are like are hardcore there. And like, listen, like I think that tech is important, but like tech is really a means of acquiring users. Okay. And like that's the real value is how many users like your business has, application has, layer one has, whatever, right? Solana has a ton of users, and there are people that are going to want to continue to use Solana. And listen, like I think the competition between Hyperliquid and Solana is good, and it's going to make both better. Our bet though is on Solana, and we're focused on Solana. We went through the material name change in September to call it Soul Strategies. We're not going anywhere, and we are very bullish on Solana.
Yeah, you want to add to that?
No, he nailed it. You're not going anywhere. But to Mass's point, we're not deaf to other exciting opportunities. I should say we're not pivoting, we're not changing our focus from Solana, but definitely always trying to learn about what's going on in the ecosystem.
Max, you mentioned that, Solana is going to bring those capabilities or whether that is high throughput or whatever. But I want to understand like what is happening currently, what is happening with Franken Dancer, Fire Dancer, and how is that going to improve Solana UX, which is already probably the best out there. But how is that going to improve?
Yeah, well, there's two main things I really want to talk about. And, there's a few, right? But in the interest of time, I'll talk about two, and I'll do it in the context of the question you asked, right? One of the most exciting ones is application specific sequencing. And what that really means is like, again, like one of, I think, the coolest things that Hyperliquid has done has been, placing cancels at the top of the block and, things like that and specific ordering to ensure the best possible trading experience that there is. Because, if market makers can't place cancels and they can't get some guarantee around that, it's a really crappy experience. There are a number of teams working on that. And I think that that's going to happen relatively soon. It might not be the prettiest way, but we will be able to get that. I'm pretty confident relatively soon. The next one, which was announced at a conference called Solana Accelerate, is Solana's new consensus algorithm called Alpenglow. And what Alpenglow really is, like really right now, like I think like, in order for any product out there in the world to really succeed, it's got to be like a 10x improvement over something. Okay. And, like if you think about like, if you're in the audience, like how many times do you switch banks in your life? Maybe a couple, whatever. Right. But, like if you got like a 10x better interest rate, you might, and Solana was really like a 10x improvement over Ethereum. Like when you're talking about 12-second block times versus 400 milliseconds, with Alpenglow, like, listen, like it's a little complicated here and there. And like, it's not fully tested. And, these results are in a lab. We can get down to 25 milliseconds. Okay. And to put that into perspective, that is faster than some centralized exchanges. Okay. And even once you get around, like in my experience working at centralized exchanges, once you get around like, like the single digit milliseconds, like in equities is different. Okay. But, like with centralized cryptocurrency exchanges, which trade over the internet, a lot of them, like fancier ones, they're co-loaded. It depends upon the exchange, right? But if you're trading over the internet, once you get to the single digit milliseconds, what actually is more important is jitter over latency. Right? Having a constant amount of jitter so that like, if you're expecting your order to take 5 milliseconds, that it actually takes 5 milliseconds, not 10, because that's the difference between you making money versus losing money. Right? If we get down to that, like 25 milliseconds, we're actually like very competitive with centralized exchanges. And I think that is really like what we should be going after versus like Solana versus Hyperliquid, Solana versus Ethereum. Like, yes, like that competition is healthy, but I think all of us in crypto really want to see volume move on chain because I think that's for the best. And I really think that like we can get there. So those two things I'm really excited about. Fire Dancer also as well. But like, again, talking about competition, like I got to give a huge amount of credit to the Anza team. The Agave client has gotten so much better to the point where, like it's might be like minimally different, and like, I'm not trying to take away any credit from the Jump team who built Fire Dancer because, that code base is incredible. I have like 4 really small PRs in there and like some of them were like 3 lines and it took like man, like 3 hours to do. Mad props to them, kudos to them. But, competition has been healthy. And, there's a lot that's coming on. I think Solana's biggest strategic advantage is it moves quickly. And, I think we're going to continue to do that. And I think we're going to just continue, like Alpenglow, like, they're trying to shoot for the end of this year, which is a major change to the consensus that brings a ton of advantages. So we'll see. But that's really what I'm most excited for. Those multiple things.
Awesome. So now that, Solana is on corporate balance sheet, when does the reverse happen? Like when are stocks coming on chain? I know that you guys have been working on it, and I want to understand what the process is like. What are the hurdles? How long really? Because we've been saying this right since Ethereum started, right? And right since Ethereum went online, we were, saying that, everything will come on chain and everything will be tokenized. But yeah, I just want to understand the process and why it takes as long as it's taking.
Yeah, great question. And there's different companies trying to go about it differently. I'll talk about ours, but I'll also talk about the others. But so, we partner with a fantastic company called Superstate. And what we're trying to do is like, this would be like an actual real stock, not like a wrapper or a derivative, like real stock with real voting rights, things like that. Okay. Like there's like no difference, register with transfer agents, like SEC register transfer agents, things like that. With that, what I really think is going like, I think that's going to happen like pretty soon, like within the next, like couple months, right? Like I think we will see stocks on chain by the end of 2025. The thing that I'm most interested in is like, obviously with, the SEC, it's to be determined how much those stocks are going to be able to be used in DeFi. We've seen Hester Pierce make some comments that, she might seek relief, like some like exploratory period for like a year and a half, right? But there's nothing really stopping like a tokenized stock being held on chain, as far as I understand it right now, sitting in a wallet, okay? But like the DeFi aspect of like being able to go and trade that on Jupiter, things like that, that is very much in the air. Now, other companies and, like partnerships, whatever, are kind of going down this like wrapper route, which I think has some advantages as well, but also like disadvantages, just like anything, it's pros and cons. I think those like, I think that there are some on Ethereum, and I can't speak so much to the differences, like the timeline on those. But, like for the ones we're working on, which is like the real tokenized equity that like to just like to go a little bit deeper, like is actually a real stock that's like KYC'd, whitelisted, like registered with the SEC. Like we think that we are close to getting there. But the biggest thing is just like how much the token will actually be able to use in DeFi, But I think it'll be a thing by the end of 2025. You disagree, Leah? Or you're good?
I agree. I'm really excited. And you see the top players talking to the SEC about it, pushing for it. Those are powerful folks with DC interests. So I'm really bullish too.
And are you guys thinking about revenue diversification at all? Beyond validators, what is it that you can do with Solana? Not just the asset, but the network itself, so that there could be more streams of revenue. I don't know. You guys are already tapping into MEVs, what I assume, because I see GTO tips on the Doom dashboard. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, so, like on the MEV thing, like I think like I actually said this on our earnings call. Someone asked me about like how we're extracting MEV. And I'm going to get into your question, but I just want to say this, that like our view though is that like we don't like overly extractive MEV. And also to be clear, like we do like run the GTO client, right? So like we are doing MEV, but we're not doing like sandwiching or anything like that. And the reason for that is because like in order for Solana to succeed, which like we are like very much vested in the interest of that, considering our treasury, right? We want more assets to be traded on chain. We want users to be trading on chain. And the only way users are going to trade on chain is if they get good prices. Okay. And with overly extractive MEV, if you're doing front running, like things like that, like it's just going to scare users away. Like why would an institution want to go and trade on chain if they're just getting an absolutely just crap price? Okay. So I want to say that. Now, on your revenue point, absolutely, like really what we are shooting for. And, like I joined in January. We've been building tech for about 6 months here. Okay. And, we've built like what I think, I'm obviously biased, but I think we've built a pretty good staking business. We're growing. You can see that on Dude, and we're going to continue to grow that out. But we want to be good stewards to the Solana network. Like we want to help that grow that out. And, we're going to do that in multiple ways. Like one of them, which, we really just talked about, is we announced our intent to be the first company to list like our stock on chain. Another thing is we launched a mobile app, it's called OrangeFin. It's in the App Store, Google Play Store, and Solana Mobile. We have some cool plans with that. And also, we want to be an infrastructure company, right? So, really, you might see us get into like other businesses within, like supporting developers, things like that. Like everything that we do, we want it to be around helping Solana succeed, right? And if there's a way to make revenue on that, like as well, so be it. We want to go after those problems. Also, too, like another area we're looking at is really like some of these like uglier problems, like taxes, reporting, things like that. Like that's an area we might explore as well.
Is there anything to add, Leah? If not, I can.
No, I totally agree. I would just say that one additional fun one, even though it's squarely within validators, is the white label validator that we run for Pudgy Penguins. And I would consider that differentiated because there's other economics that you can cut through white label validator services. So even though it still is squarely validators, I think that new business line is important to know.
So is it like you run validators for them? How does that work?
Yeah, it's that. Like, Solana is an awesome network because it's like it scales so much, but it's like tough to run a validator, right? Like, not anyone can just go and do it. Like, there's a lot of complexity on the back end. There are a lot of companies that want to run validators, and basically, like Pudgy Penguin's fantastic partner, it came to us saying we want to run a validator, we don't want to run it. We have a lot of experience doing that. We have blog posts basically about how we've automated the whole process. So we run a validator for them. That's another distinct business line that I completely forgot to mention. Thank you, Leah, for mentioning it. And yeah, like there's a company out there and you're listening and you want to run a validator, hit us up.
Awesome. So more of a general question. Like you've been deep in Solana network for a long time. Are there like one or two things which you think that, okay, this is where it really needs to improve?
Yeah, there's a bunch, right? Like, and like one of the things I like about Solana is that like everyone is so honest about how like bad the problems are. Okay. I think the jitter on Solana has been getting rough, and that's going to be really important. And what I mean by jitter for like the less technical people is like the difference in like if you submit a transaction and let's just say, it takes like hypothetically 1 millisecond to submit, and then the next time it takes 2, like for the average retail user who might be listening to this, like you might not care, but for a trader, that's a huge thing. I think that needs to improve and there's a lot of work being done there. I think that the developer experience on Solana, while there's a lot of work being done on it, there still needs to be some work there. And it's kind of like Solana's greatest strength and greatest weakness as well, in that it is a complicated system to learn because, like other chains out there, Hyperliquid, went with an EVM model, like a modified EVM type thing. Solana, completely different, SVM. And there's just like really like no, there's not that much in common between the SVM and the EVM. And, in order to like, it takes a while to understand the SVM. There's a lot of like weird things you got to get through to deploy a program on chain. And there's like all these different frameworks, you got Anchor, you got other things out there like Pinocchio, like there's one that, I forget, I don't know why I'm blanking on the name. I didn't get a lot of sleep, but like, so there, like that I think can be improved. Yeah. Like, I think, and then like I can get like really technical, like stake weight quality of service. It's caused some issues here and there. Right. But, like overall, like Solana's like main like motto is IBRL, increase bandwidth, reduce latency. Right. And we can continue to do that. There's a lot of things in the pipeline. I touched on a lot of them. I'm not going to harp on them again, but I think the jitter is definitely like been getting a little rough, and yeah, developer experience.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for spending time. I really enjoyed it. And I can't wait to see like Soul Strategies trading on chain and then a bunch of stocks, just as you guys added Solana and then other people started doing it. I hope the same thing repeats and we bring real world things on chain and not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Same. Thank you so much for having us, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.